So we'd love if you could chip in. And the links to do that are on the same bit.ly link. Okay, enough about me and Carrie. I'm going to turn it over to Denise Taliaferro, who will be our moderator for the panel this evening. Take it away, Denise.
Okay, hi everyone. As Justin said, I will be moderating the panel tonight. My goal will be to make sure we get to cover the information, which there's a lot of. So I may need to jump in at times to make sure we stay on track and to make sure we have time for Q&A. We've divided the evening up into two sections. The first panel discussion will be about a policy overview of each of the bills. And our presenters will speak to the bills at that point. During this section, we ask that any questions just be limited to questions regarding clarification of the bills, and those can be posted in the chat. For the second part of the discussion, that will be focused, our presenters will focus on a political overview of the bills. And then after they're done presenting on that, we'll have time to open it up to a more broad question and answer session. So with that, in keeping with our time schedule, I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Amy Moses. Amy is Vice President and Director of Conservation Law Foundation, Rhode Island. Before joining CLF, Amy was Deputy Counsel to Governor Raimondo. She has served as a law clerk in Rhode Island State and Federal Courts and spent several years as a litigation associate at Scabnarps. Before attending law school, she was a program development coordinator for the Rhode Island chapter of the ACLU and a conservation organizer for the Rhode Island chapter of the Sierra Club. And Amy will be presenting on the Act on Climate 2021 bill. Amy, you want to go ahead?
Thanks so much, Denise. Thanks to everyone at Carrie for having me tonight. I am really grateful for the work that Carrie does, from organizing trainings to protests, to the sea level rise banner, to turning folks out the State House. Justin, I'm really excited to see this LED banner that you talked about. I can only imagine what that looks like. As Denise mentioned, I have the privilege of doing environmental advocacy work as my paid full-time job. On the other hand, many of you are doing this as volunteers, and that is really tremendous. You care so much about this issue that you make the time to do the research, to go to the meetings, to contact your legislators, to attend events, and I really cannot thank all of you enough for doing that work. It's particularly great tonight in our weird COVID time to see so many familiar faces from folks who I've had the opportunity to work with on the fight against the Invenergy power plant and getting plastic ordinances. So thank you all for being here and all the work that you do. It's really important to have every one of you involved, literally acting on climate. As we'll get into later, legislators want to hear from their constituents. So when you are calling them or testifying at what may be these strange virtual committee hearings, please share your own personal stories and your own experiences and tell them why climate matters to you. This really helps the elected officials understand the urgency of the climate crisis and why it matters to you. It's so much more effective than just talking about facts and figures. And we really need you participating to help all of us advance the ball on the climate crisis. I am going to start by giving some background on the Act on Climate bill. And then later on, as Denise mentioned, we'll talk about some unique aspects of this year. So the Act on Climate bill is an update to the Resilient Rhode Island Act, which is a law that was passed in 2014. And I want to thank the folks who worked on getting the Resilient Rhode Island Act on the books. I saw Timmons Roberts on the Zoom, and I know he worked on that. The Resilient Rhode Island Act did several things, including creating a body called the Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council, and that's known as the EC4. That is sort of the governing body that we have in Rhode Island to address the climate crisis. And it is made up of the heads of executive branch agencies. It is chaired by the director of the Department of Environmental Management, and it's got a couple of advisory bodies. And the EC4 and those advisory bodies have public meetings. So you can see their agendas, you can get notice, and you can attend if you want to see what's happening in the state or what's not happening on the climate crisis. The Resilient Rhode Island Act also put some goals on the books for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And it required a plan to figure out how we were going to meet those goals. So the goal that's currently on the books is an 80% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So this was a solid start for getting Rhode Island to focus on the climate crisis, but it is not nearly enough. I want to recognize Ken Payne, who works with a number of groups, including the Civic Alliance for Cooler Rhode Island. They released a report in late 2018, and it pointed out a number of deficiencies with the EC4, how we're addressing the climate crisis, and pointed out some ways we could make improvements. So between the 2014 passage of the Resilient Rhode Island Act and today, there have been several bills that were designed to update and improve the law. None of them have passed, which is really unfortunate, but that's where we are today. Recently, in 2018 and 2019, there were bills called the Global Warming Solutions Act. That's the name that Massachusetts and Connecticut have. Actually, Vermont has the same name as well now. Those states all have binding, legitimate climate goals on the books. So we had taken a similar path and tried to get a law passed with the same name in Rhode Island. They were comprehensive bills with a lot of details on how we were going to get there. Those bills did not go anywhere. So having no success with a big comprehensive bill with the same name as the other states, we switched gears. And last year in 2020, we unveiled what was known as the Act on Climate Bill. And it is a lot shorter and a lot simpler than those earlier efforts. What the Act on Climate Bill does is update the Resilient Rhode Island Act and really give it some teeth. It is a basic foundational bill. It directs and quite frankly demands that the state enact policies and programs to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And it does it throughout the entire economy. It's just not one specific sector. So it sets hard targets. It's like coming up with a rule. It's a mandate. Here's what you have got to achieve, state. You've absolutely got to do this. And it's comprehensive. It's the whole economy. It's basic in that it doesn't say exactly how we're going to get from point A to point B. It gives the state some discretion to figure out what to do first. And once this law is on the books and we have this solid foundation for where we need to go, then we can focus on how we're going to get there. What we have been seeing over the last several years at the EC4 and in the climate space in Rhode Island is sector-specific initiatives, like something, in the electricity sector or something in the transportation sector. And there have been meetings and there have been consultants writing reports, but this is not reducing our emissions. What we need is action. We need a solid foundation in place to figure out what our targets are. What do we need to do? How much do we need to reduce our emissions? And that is exactly what the Act on Climate Bill does. I want to highlight 3 features of the bill. And as I said, I'm focused on the 2020 bill. The first aspect is science. We know a lot more than we knew in 2014. And we know that 80% reduction by 2050 is just nowhere near good enough. So what the Act on Climate Bill does is update that to net zero by 2050. And this aligns us with Massachusetts and the Paris Accord. And generally speaking, we're moving in the right direction and trying to keep up with science. There's also an element of transparency. We don't know now exactly too much of what's happening with the state as we move towards our climate goals. So the Act on Climate Bill would require public metrics and a dashboard tracking our emissions reductions. And this would have to be updated at least every year so we would know what was going on. And third is accountability. Right now, if the state is not doing what it's supposed to be doing to reduce our emissions, we have absolutely no recourse. So there is an enforcement section in the Act on Climate Bill that would allow folks to go to court and sue the government if they're not following the law. Now, this is not a lawsuit to get a lot of money. These would be lawsuits to force the state to actually take action and reduce the emissions. So those are 3 key features of the Act on Climate Bill: science, transparency, and accountability. Now, I would love to be able to give you a bill number right now for the Act on Climate Bill for 2021, and I would love to be able to tell you exactly what is in there. We do not have those details yet for a variety of reasons. What I'm hoping for is a bill that has those 3 essential ingredients and also takes a couple of more important step forwards. Later on, as Denise mentioned, we're going to get into the politics of how to get climate bills passed. And we're also going to talk about why we have this delay with the Act on Climate Bill this year and what this year's legislative session is going to look like. So thanks again, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Oh, great. Thanks, Amy. Next, we have our next presenter is Emma Bouton. Emma is the organizing director for Renew New England. She works to support coalitions of more than 150 grassroots organizations in the 6 New England states to run advocacy campaigns for racial, economic, and environmental justice. She is also a volunteer organizer with the youth-led Sunrise Movement in Providence and helped to lead their electoral field program this summer. Emma will be discussing the Rescue Rhode Island Act, which is actually a package of 3 bills directed to housing, food, and green justice. So Emma, you're not on my screen. Oh, there you are.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for having me to Carrie. And yeah, I just wanted to start off by sharing a little bit more about Renew, since we are a new and growing coalition. So as Denise just mentioned, Renew New England is a coalition of over 150 grassroots organizations, including frontline communities, labor unions, indigenous tribes, environmental justice advocates, youth groups, and racial justice organizations. And so we came together about a year ago because we really saw the power in being able to work together both locally and at a regional scale to tackle New England's interconnected crises of mass unemployment, racial injustice, COVID, and climate change. And so, as many of us know from working on these issues for a while, our small New England states often only want to act on something if our neighboring states are doing it too. So that's why we see a lot of power in being able to push for bold policy change across our states and really work together and share the lessons learned while we're fighting to enact it. So here in Rhode Island, our coalition of 20 grassroots groups, which is chaired by Monica Huertas of the People's Port Authority, formerly No LNG and PVD, has been meeting since the spring to develop a policy agenda for 2021, which I'm really excited to dive into today. And you can check out more about our coalition on our website, which is renewri.org. So the basic idea behind our legislative package is that Rhode Island's facing a series of overlapping crises of mass unemployment, racial injustice, a really severe shortage of affordable housing, a rapidly accelerating eviction emergency, widespread food insecurity, extreme pollution, and climate change. And because we know how deeply tied together each of these problems are and how impossible it really is to address one without addressing all of the others, our legislation seeks to work on them simultaneously. So the legislative package that I'll dive into tonight includes 3 bills, one for housing, one for sustainably produced food, and one to protect clean air and water. And so the whole package is designed to create jobs, advance racial justice, promote economic fairness, and really begin the systemic transformations that we need for a sustainable future where every Rhode Islander has housing and food and clean air and water. So over the course of the decade, the Rescue Rhode Island Act will create thousands of dignified, well-compensated jobs and launch the large-scale union-led job training programs that will equip workers with the skills for these rapidly expanding green industries. It'll also dismantle pollution in frontline and overburdened communities and fund environmental remediation projects like replacing lead pipes for local residents. It'll build thousands of units of high quality, green, affordable housing and install rooftop solar panels for tens of thousands of low income households, slashing carbon emissions and dramatically reducing utility bills for low income customers. We'll also establish a network of urban community gardens and rural farms that pay workers fair wages to grow local nutritious food using regenerative agriculture practices, which will promote ecological sustainability and enhance food security for low-income communities and reduce Rhode Island's dependence on global carbon-intensive supply chains. And finally, it'll jumpstart these high-paying unionized green industries like energy-efficient housing construction and solar panel installation that will create unprecedented and widely shared prosperity throughout the state. So yeah, I want to dive into the first piece, which is housing. So many of us know Rhode Island has a really severe shortage of affordable homes. And even before the COVID-induced economic recession, over 22% of renters in our state were severely cost burdened, meaning that they were paying more than 50% of their income on rent. And this affordability crisis is particularly severe in Black and Brown communities across the state. And housing accounts for 19% of Rhode Island's greenhouse gas emissions, largely because homes in our state aren't sufficiently energy efficient and don't have solar panels on them. So to address all of these problems simultaneously, we're planning to launch the Housing Jobs Construction Program, which will build thousands of high quality, energy efficient residential apartments all across the state and equip buildings with rooftop solar panels. So these apartments will be available to low and middle income families, and residents won't be charged more than 20% of their annual income on rent. And the growing presence of these low-cost apartments will reduce our systemic shortage of affordable housing in Rhode Island and drive down rental fees all across the state. And these new housing units will be interspersed with market rate units to avoid segregating low-income communities into isolated apartment buildings. And one crucial factor contributing to our state's housing crisis right now is the rising cost of utilities, which low-income residents are facing shutoffs all across our state. So to reduce utility bills and reduce our carbon emissions, we're also planning to launch the Solar Jobs Program, which will install rooftop solar panels for free on tens of thousands of homes and apartment buildings, beginning with low-income communities. And we also worked really closely with our partner at the George Wiley Center to include language to protect low-income utility customers from shutoffs by prohibiting utilities from charging more than 2% of their income on annual utility bills. So the Housing Construction Program and Solar Jobs Program will create thousands of new jobs across the state, and all of these jobs will be protected by project labor agreements, or PLAs, which will ensure that all workers employed in these programs receive fair wages and high quality benefits through collective bargaining. And additionally, by requiring that all of these apartments are built through PLAs, we'll create opportunities for labor unions to establish and fund apprenticeship programs. And finally, last piece of housing is that landlord-tenant laws in Rhode Island currently are severely imbalanced, and they're systemically prioritizing the interests of landlords. So in this legislation, we'll also strengthen tenant protections, banning no-cause evictions, and prohibiting landlords from discriminating against tenants who receive federal housing assistance. And we'll actually ramp up enforcement to make sure that those provisions are being enacted as well. And so all of these programs can be funded with $200 million each year for the rest of the decade. And on to food, if we can go to the next slide. So like is the case across Rhode Island, the overwhelming majority of the food that we eat in our state is produced by giant industrialized agriculture companies that degrade the environment and exploit vulnerable workers. And then this food is shipped into Rhode Island through highly carbon intensive supply chains that accelerate the climate crisis. And this current system really fails to feed many people in our state, with a quarter of Rhode Islanders struggling to afford food right now. So this legislation works to build a new food system by developing a network of community land trusts throughout the state that will pay workers fair wages to produce local food in ecologically sustainable ways. And these community land trusts will be democratically controlled by local communities who will get to decide what kinds of food to grow and how to distribute it. And funding to establish these new community land trusts will be directed towards low and middle income communities, and will also provide subsidies to local farmers that adopt or want to continue using regenerative agriculture practices to reduce the use of poisonous chemical pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers, and improve soil health by sequestering carbon into the ground. And as we know, agriculture is really tied to the surrounding ecosystem, and the rapidly accelerating environmental degradation in our state is really threatening our ability to grow more food here locally by damaging biodiversity and destroying pollinator habitats and eroding local soil. So by supporting local agriculture, we'll also establish an ecosystem restoration program, which will rehabilitate damaged forests and fields and coastlines and increase our state's resilience to extreme weather events, enabling us to further localize our food production here in Rhode Island. And that program will be funded with $75 million each year. And then finally is green justice zones. And this idea really builds upon a lot of work that's been done by the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee in Providence to implement 2 green justice zones in the city. And this proposal would essentially add additional funding to this work and use the power of the state to be able to kick out pollution intensive facilities in the zone, which I'll get to in a bit. So essentially, green justice zones address the problem that for decades, giant corporations have poisoned our air and water, and particularly in Black and Brown communities in low-income neighborhoods. And so this program will establish a green justice zone in the neighborhoods of Washington Park and the south side of Providence, one of the most severely polluted areas in the entire state. And we will dismantle polluting intensive facilities such as petroleum refineries and hazardous waste storage sites within the green justice zone and protect residents from the severe health effects of living near these highly toxic facilities. And we'll also provide funding for environmental remediation projects such as replacing lead pipes or expanding green space to residents in the zone. And residents in the zone will get to choose through a local referendum which of these environmental remediation projects they want to prioritize and fund. And the jobs that are created through this program will be given primarily to zone residents and to individuals who are currently employed by pollution-intensive industries within the zone that will be forced to move or shut down. And the Green Justice Zone in the south side of Providence will be the first of many zones, is the idea, throughout the state, kind of modeling the types of benefits that communities across Rhode Island will receive over the next decade of the Green Justice Zone program. And finally, in the immediate term, we'll mirror a law that just passed New Jersey that will prohibit new pollution-intensive facilities from being built in communities in any part of the state that are already overburdened by pollution. And all of these projects can be accomplished with a $25 million a year investment. So that is our plan to ensure that every Rhode Islander can have dignified work and a roof over their heads, enough food, and can play or walk outside with clean air. And yeah, can't wait to dive into next the fight to how to make this policy a reality with you all.
Great. Thank you, Emma. And then our third presenter tonight is Kai Salem. Kai is the policy coordinator at Green Energy Consumers Alliance and the vice president for policy for the Environmental Council of Rhode Island, where she facilitates the climate crisis campaign. Kai is also an active member of CARI. Kai will be discussing 3 bills tonight: the 100% renewable electricity by 2030 bill, the Transportation Climate Initiative, and the Energy Efficiency via Least Cost Procurement Bill. So, Kai?
Thank you, Denise. And thank you to Amy and Emma and to the CARI team for having us all tonight. Like Amy, I'm a full-time climate policy advocate. I'm with Green Energy Consumers Alliance and proud to be a member of CARI. And after several years of inaction, I am thrilled that this year is an opportunity to jumpstart urgent climate action in Rhode Island. I want to start with the policy discussed by Amy, the Act on Climate. So we can go to a click forward. Great. So the Act on Climate, as Amy discussed, will make Rhode Island's carbon emissions targets mandatory and economy-wide. The Act on Climate would establish this feasible and necessary target, as well as creating the accountability to make sure we reach it. Like I said, this is a feasible and necessary target, and achieving it with the right policy will lead to an equitable, affordable, and carbon-free energy system for Rhode Islanders. The good news with this very ambitious goal is that we're not starting from scratch. Today, I'll talk about 3 policies that have a good chance of passage this year. They would speed Rhode Island on the transition to low carbon energy, and they build on Rhode Island's already strong base of climate policy. Next slide. So what are we talking about when we're talking about net zero carbon by 2050? What that means is shrinking this pie to 0. The plurality of our emissions are from the transportation sector. That's one of the most challenging sectors to decarbonize. After that, our emissions are coming from heating. That includes air conditioners, building heating, industrial thermal, and residential heating. Finally, the smallest sector, but a very, very important one, because electricity will anchor our decarbonization of all of these sectors, is electric consumption. Next slide. So I'll start with talking about how we can address transportation emissions. The policy that we'll be working on this year, and I should also mention that, like Amy, none of our bills have bill numbers yet. And so we're still waiting on the legislative session to move quickly enough to get all of these bills introduced in the final details. But I will focus on what we most want to see from the policies. The Transportation and Climate Initiative is a regional initiative to reduce carbon emissions from our transportation sector and to reinvest a bunch of revenue into our most vulnerable communities. This initiative was announced just before Christmas in 2020. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and DC are the founding members, although we hope that many other states will join on as this initiative proves successful. The initiative will put a cap on carbon pollution from transportation. The importers and suppliers of gasoline and diesel will pay to pollute, basically. They will be having to pay for the bad impacts that they're having on our economy. And then that money will be reinvested in communities. This will fund the expansion of transit, transportation electrification, and because the impacts of transportation emissions are by far most felt in communities that are otherwise vulnerable. This is a needed equitable policy. In Rhode Island, we do need enabling legislation to allow the executive branch to join this policy, which is going to bring so much money into Rhode Island for clean and equitable transportation. Next slide. The second biggest sector of our carbon emissions in Rhode Island is heating and cooling. So all of the emissions that come from our buildings. That's especially, for example, the natural gas pipelines that are delivering natural gas heating and cooking into our homes, industrial processes that rely on natural gas or oil and propane heated homes. The good news is that Rhode Island has already a very successful program in place to start reducing emissions from our building sector. Those are our state energy efficiency programs. They are by far our biggest state clean energy program. They reduced our electric demand 10% since 2005. And that's the kind of thing we need to be seeing just bumped up a notch or 5 for the coming decades. They drive the majority of our state clean energy jobs. Unfortunately, least cost procurement is set to expire in 2023, and it needs to be extended and improved. Although these programs are really awesome, they just are not doing enough compared to what we need to see from decarbonization. Some of the improvements that we'll be advocating for include requiring funding for electrification of buildings. Over the past couple of years, we've seen the Public Utilities Commission kind of chip away at these programs, successively disallowing funding for electrification of buildings, disallowing funding for workforce development. And we need to tell the PUC through statute that these programs are integral to our decarbonization of buildings. We also want to make greenhouse gas reductions an explicit goal of the program and set stronger equity targets and requirements. Energy efficiency is truly my favorite clean energy policy because it works under the radar. I think energy efficiency is not nearly as flashy as building offshore wind turbines or putting solar on your rooftops. The insulation in your walls are not necessarily what people think about when we're thinking about clean energy. But like I said, these programs have done more than anything else to reduce emissions, and they also save a ton of money for consumers. Every single dollar invested into our state energy efficiency programs brings even more dollars back to consumers in the form of utility bill savings and environmental benefits. So the fact that we are not already focused on strengthening energy efficiency as the foundational approach to decarbonizing our heating sector is a problem. So this year we'll be working very hard to extend and strengthen these energy efficiency programs. Next slide. So as I think most of us on the call know, the key to decarbonizing our heating sector and our transportation sector is through electrification, because there's just, well, although there's some controversy around this, green energy consumers believe that there's no straightforward and cost-effective way to run our transportation and heating systems on fossil fuels like oil, natural gas, and gasoline. We need to electrify all of our heating systems and all of our transportation. And for that to be decarbonized, we also need to get to 100% renewable electricity as fast as possible. Many of you will remember that about a year ago now, Governor Raimondo announced a goal to get to 100% renewable electricity by 2030. Although that was a great announcement and we support that ambitious goal, we think it's doable, it needs to be actually set into statute before that happens. This session, we'll be working on a bill to update the renewable energy standard from 30% by 2030 to 100%. On the right here, there's a kind of wonky graph, but to walk you through it, along the bottom of the chart is currently procured renewable energy. So what is our renewable energy given current procurements like the Revolution Wind offshore wind project and our solar programs going to look like by 2030? There is a gap, but we can close that gap to get to 2030 through future procurements of offshore wind. This does not include the 600 megawatt offshore wind procurement just announced in the fall. So Through offshore wind development, strengthening our renewable energy programs, we can get to 100% renewable electricity by 2030, which would accelerate all of our work to decarbonize the heating and transportation sectors. And next slide. I think I'll save this slide for when we talk about our strategies to passing all these bills. But although we have a really great opportunity to pass these bills because of changing leadership, the work that has been put into place by the administration and all of these advocates, we need a big groundswell. I think that legislators don't realize that people in Rhode Island want climate action, need climate action, and are terrified for the future of our state. So Carrie has done a really incredible job educating people and involving people in policy. So I'm really excited what's going to come out of this meeting. And I will end it here, and then we can talk more about it in our strategy sections.
Great. Thank you, Kai. We actually are ahead of schedule, and we have a couple minutes if anyone has any questions about the bills themselves. I think most of that, I think everything that was posted in the chat room has been fielded already, but if anyone has any questions about what was just presented, we have a couple minutes for those. If you want to put those in the chat. All right. I think everyone, I think we're ready. Oh, no, we have a question. Kai, will the base load go up with electrification?
Yes, great question. So yes, definitely, as we're electrifying heating and transportation, we'll see some really big changes to what our electric load looks like. One of these is that we'll actually be using more electricity in the winter than in the summer because the electricity peak will be driven by electric heating systems rather than electric air conditioning. Certainly electrifying transportation will be a huge jump. However, we can offset a lot of this through smart energy efficiency. We can also offset it by managing our electric usage throughout the day so that there isn't a giant peak that necessitates the build out of electric infrastructure. Projections indicate that in large part, the heating sector and transportation sector electrification won't start impacting our electric load until after 2030, which is not to say that that's not a problem now, but it is one that we expect future technology and future policy to be able to address as time goes on.
Okay. And then we have another question. Is expanding the grid considered infrastructure?
Ooh, I'm not sure exactly the context, but I would consider electric grid a form of infrastructure, absolutely.
Yeah. And also we have another question from an inventor who says the path to 100% on-demand renewable electricity goes through engineering and technology. Is that part of the legislation going to be in place? Is there going to be anything directed to innovation in these bills?
I will say in the 3 bills that we work on, innovation is an important part of the energy efficiency programs, and the administrator of the energy efficiency programs is always testing new ways to do energy efficiency. Similarly, we expect the Transportation and Climate Initiative funding to be utilized to test out new technology in Rhode Island. However, I often say that we have the technology we need. At this point, solving the climate crisis is not a technological barrier so much as it is just getting the ball rolling and actually passing some good policies.
Oh, and then we have I'm sorry if I'm missing any questions here, that a couple came in. Oh, we have a question from Sasha. What was the outcome of the Brattle Group's final analysis with the OER? Is 100% renewable electricity feasible without significant improvements in storage tech? I don't know if that falls in here or the next category. Kai, do you want to address that here, or should we table that?
Sure, I think that's more about policy content than political strategy. So I will say that the Brattle Group concluded that We will need a lot more investment in storage after 2030 as we see more heating electrification load come on, more transportation electrification load come on. But by 2030, we should be able to do it through procurement of offshore wind and working within the regional electric grid. Also, storage, battery storage technology is dropping in price faster than like any technology anyone's ever seen. So I think by 2030, there should be some good options.
Okay. And then a question for Emma. Does the 2% cap reduce motivation to conserve energy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is some language in the bill that essentially sets a limit around the amount of energy that a household is using based on kind of median household income or household energy usage with a bit of buffer room. But I think also, as we know, the vast majority of energy used in this country is not being consumed by low-income residents. It's being consumed by the top 1%. So yeah, it's certainly an element in the bill to make sure that there isn't like excessive energy use, but by and large, that's not really an issue that we've run across.
Okay, and then one more question on that for you as well. Does the housing bill incentivize landlords to install solar on their rental properties?
Yeah, so my understanding is that there are incentives for landlords to be installing these solar arrays, and the priority for the free solar panels are going to low-income residents first. And yeah, there's certainly incentive to install them on rental properties.
Okay, great. I think there's a number of comments you can all see in the chat, but I think we addressed the questions related to the actual bills. Am I missing anything here? So I think we're ready. Oh, okay. Kai is going to have to switch to her phone. Okay, so we're ready for the next panel, which will be the political overview. And we'll go back in the same order, starting with Amy to address the political landscape, the barriers, how Cary members can support these bills. And we'll do we have a few minutes scheduled for that. And then at the end of that, at the end of our presenter speaking, we'll have another time slot available for Q&A. So Amy, whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks Denise, and really appreciate the excellent presentations by Emma and Kai. There is a lot happening this year on climate, and that is really exciting. Lots of great questions as well. I saw a couple fly by about solar siting, and there are different bills that will be addressing that issue. So if folks have particular concerns about solar siting, I know Kai or I would be happy to talk to you about that offline. So switching gears here, how are we going to get these bills passed? It is going to be a new and different legislative session presenting both challenges and opportunities. I've been at the State House on and off for 20 years now, and I'm not sure what to make of this year. The first thing I want to address is the delay in the Act on Climate bill, not having a number yet and all the details. And there's a few factors contributing to that, and I'd like to address 3 of them. As we all know, COVID has changed our lives in so many ways. COVID is creating a lot of operational challenges for the legislature. They are trying to figure out when to meet, where to meet, how to stay safe, how to get people to sign bills. There's limited capacity for committee hearings. Those of you who have spent time at the State House know there can be half a dozen different committee hearings happening at the same time. It sounds like technology is only going to allow a couple to happen at the same time, so that's going to make it difficult to schedule hearings. They've had some meetings so far, and folks are allowed to testify, but it's essentially by phone, and they have a picture of you up. So it's taking a fair bit of resources for the legislature just to figure out how this legislative session is even going to function. Second, I saw this flyby in the chat. We have a new Speaker of the House, which is exciting and presents a lot of opportunity. The outgoing speaker, you guys probably all know this, said he didn't think there was anything we could do here in Rhode Island about climate. So it is exciting that we have a new person in the powerful position of Speaker of the House. We haven't yet seen who is going to be chairing the various committees for sure, including the Environmental Committee. We don't know which legislators are going to be on which committees. I may have missed it today, but I'm not even certain if the House has adopted its rules yet for how it's going to operate. So there has been a lot of focus and attention, particularly in the House, on these matters. So there's a lot of things we don't know yet. And third, also saw this in the chat, seems like the governor is heading to Washington. Some of you may have tuned in for her hearing today, and this impacts the legislative branch, the executive branch's legislative agenda, rather, and that includes the Department of Environmental Management. And as I said earlier, the director of the Department of Environmental Management chairs the EC4, which is responsible for addressing climate here in Rhode Island. Last year, Director Coit testified in support of the Act on Climate bill. Now, they had some concerns, but she was there at the table testifying in support of this bill. That is super helpful. When you're trying to get a bill passed that is the legislature telling agencies and the executive branch what to do, when you have the person who is going to be responsible for doing that work sitting at the table saying, I support this, we can do this, that makes it a lot easier for the legislature to feel comfortable that they're passing a law that's actually going to be implemented and be enacted. Right now, it is tricky to know what the Department of Environmental Management's position is going to be. We're getting a new governor. We could have a new director of the Department of Environmental Management. I don't know. We could have the same director. She may be trying to implement a different agenda. So, we've had a number of conversations with them about improving the bill, but we don't know yet what things are going to look like coming from that agency. So unfortunately, we don't know yet. We're working on it. We hope that a lot of these things will get sorted out. The lieutenant governor seems really busy with his transition. I think his staff is like 7 people, and they are trying to figure out how to run the entire state government with 7 people. And it's unclear exactly when the governor would be confirmed and he would take over. So there's just a lot of uncertainties right now with COVID, with the new speaker, and with the new governor. So how are we going to get these bills passed? We really need a solid foundation. We need these science-based targets. We need some insight into what the government's doing, and we absolutely need that accountability measure so we can hold the state's feet to the fire if they're not getting the work done. And this is what Carrie does so well. You guys all know this. You show up, you turn out, you testify, you write letters, you contact your legislators, you send emails. And when we do get a bill number for all of these bills, I'm confident that Carrie is going to send you an alert and going to send you links to the bills, and is going to let you know when those hearings are happening. You guys really have that infrastructure in place, and it works well. And that should work the same this year. And I mentioned the traditional ways that all of us have done to get things passed. We organize press conferences. We flood the state house. We talk to our legislators. Well, that's going to be really hard to do this year because of COVID. It's just not safe, and the way they're meeting, it's not going to work. We can rely on, the traditional ways of testifying and letters to the editors and op-eds and, social media. And I would absolutely encourage everyone to do all of those things and get your friends and family on board. We've got to do those traditional forms of advocacy. You guys are creative and resourceful, and I am hoping that working together, we can come up with some new ideas in this COVID environment to get the word out and get the message across to the legislature that Rhode Islanders really care about climate, and now is the year to act. We've heard mentioned a couple times the climate justice ordinances in the city of Providence. The city council meeting recently, it's a different setup. You actually, like we are now, you can see faces on screens. And for that meeting, someone's creative idea, not mine, was to have everyone change their screen name to something like, I support climate justice. So it looked like, oh my gosh, there's all these people here and they have the same message and they want the same ordinances passed. And I thought that was super cool and an effective thing to do. We can't exactly do that if the legislature proceeds the way we think we're going to proceed, because our faces aren't on the screen. But that is just one example of folks seeing this new world we're operating in as an opportunity and being creative and trying to, I'm seeing Senator Anderson post a comment, sorry, distracted, finding new and exciting ways to engage in this COVID environment. And I think law school zapped a lot of the creativity out of me, but I am relying on all of you to come up with creative ideas, LED banners, like Justin mentioned, and other ways that we can be effective and operate in a socially distant, safe way in this new environment. And I'm hoping Kai and Emma have some ideas as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Emma, are you ready to discuss your thoughts on the political overview for your bill?
Yeah, for sure. And thanks for highlighting, Amy, that really great idea around the changing the names recently. I also saw that and it was brilliant, whoever came up with that. So yeah, I think exciting news from our end is that we have had our lead co-sponsors submit the legislation to Legislative Council today. So that is going in and starting that process of having the bill's text be revised, and then that's going to be sent back. And sort of as Amy said, we're not exactly sure what that timeline looks like, but anticipating probably sometime around mid-February, we'll have the actual bill numbers and the text will be finalized. And so then all of our co-sponsors will be able to add on additional co-sponsors. And so what our kind of advocacy period looks like from now until kind of that mid-February for like the next month or so is really increasing the pressure to have legislators sign on as co-sponsors for all of these bills. And so, yeah, our amazing lead sponsors for the housing bill are Jonathan Acosta in the Senate and Brianna Henry's in the House. For the food bill, they're Kendra Anderson, shout out, thanks for being on this call, and Leonela Felix. And for Green Justice Zones, they're Tiara Mack and David Morales. And yeah, so excited to have them all as our lead sponsors, and yeah, continuing to work on expanding that list of co-sponsors. So some of the things that we're working on to get us there are really kind of launching a grassroots advocacy effort, kind of unlike the state has ever seen before. We're trying to go really big, and we already have 2 phone banks a week scheduled where we'll be calling into voters in target districts and talking to them about the legislation, hearing their stories about housing and food and clean air and water and why these issues matter to them, and then encouraging them to reach out and contact their legislator and starting to build up the pressure for folks to support this legislation and sign on as co-sponsors. And then, yeah, we've been doing a lot of brainstorming with the groups in our coalition, and are excited to continue to do that with all of you around how do we continue to build pressure in this sort of unprecedented year. So some of the things we've started talking about are handing out flyers and target districts, and hosting virtual lobby days, and yeah, trying to get really huge attendance at hearings. We were really excited to see over 550 people at our launch a couple weeks ago. And so trying to see if we can match that for attendance at hearings and getting people to talk about why they support the bills. Also thinking about filming some like grassroots videos of folks talking about why these issues matter to them, and sharing that with legislators, and doing things like letters to the editor, and all of the things that Amy mentioned that we're all sort of good at. And then, yeah, excited to think about doing things like actions with some of the other partner organizations in the coalition. Love the idea of the banner drop, and can't wait to see pictures of that tomorrow. So yeah, I think there's lots of opportunities for creativity around tactics here. And yeah, so I think with all of that, we're building a massive campaign to win, and we need all of you. So I'll drop a link in that has kind of our upcoming trainings and phone banks. If anyone wants to get involved, we would really love to have you. And if you want to reach out to your own legislator, there's a tool to do that on our website, which I'll also drop back in under the Take Action button. It'll help you find your legislator and give you a sample script to use to reach out by phone and email.
Great, thank you, Emma. And then Kai, could you discuss the political overview for your 3 bills?
Sure. So I think Amy covered a lot of really great points around the importance of getting people involved and working with different constituents, as well as the landscape and how the landscape has changed when it comes to getting climate bills passed in the General Assembly. We think that this is a great opportunity to get bills passed this year, because the Senate has committed to doing more climate action, and we have climate advocates and leadership in both chambers, and the main obstructionist to climate policy on the House side is no longer the Speaker, which is great to see. We think that working with a really wide variety of stakeholders is key to getting things passed. The last year, after a few years of not seeing any climate policy passed, a number of stakeholders got together to launch the Climate Crisis Campaign, which Carrie has been a really great part of. And that campaign worked to bring non-traditional allies on board, including faith groups, justice advocates, labor organizations, and the city of Providence passed a resolution to support the Climate Crisis Campaign. That was awesome to see. So this year we're going to be continuing that work. So building really strong relationships with people beyond the environmental community, because the climate crisis affects all of us. We also know how important the grassroots activism is. Again, letting our leadership know, our political leaders know that Rhode Islanders want to see climate action. Last year, we had a couple of phone banks for the Act on Climate bill, as well as the biggest environmental committee hearing that I think any of the advocates could remember for the Act on Climate bill right before the pandemic suspended the legislature. So we will be working and invite all of us to join an even bigger movement this year, despite all of the wonkiness and changes to the legislative session. So I think between changes in political leadership and good relationships between bill sponsors and political leadership, widening the tent, so working with non-traditional allies on climate policy, and the grassroots activism of folks like the people in this room or elsewhere, that is why we have such a huge opportunity for climate action this year. Finally, Amy did mention the gubernatorial transition, and I think that is important to note. Several of the bills that we were working on had been announced priorities of the governor, specifically Transportation and Climate Initiative and the 100% Renewable Electricity Standard. So we are certainly optimistic that the incoming governor will support these bills as strongly as Governor Raimondo did. And yet, with or without that support, I think now is the time to be passing them.
Great. Thanks, Kai.
Should I take over? We're through this part of the agenda early, which is amazing given how much has just been communicated. But it means we have extra time to ask questions and get answers. But first, I just want to mention, we're going to put a link up in the chat that is a very short survey, a couple questions to get your input on these 7 bills. Which ones you're most excited about, which ones you would be motivated to actually put time in on. And that will get, give us a sense of what the feeling is out there as we move forward. This is the start of our effort to really, for Carrie to really support some legislation and get it passed this year. We might just, have to decide which bills to really focus on, and your input will be great about that. So that will show up in the chat. And if you take a moment to fill that out when you get a chance, if you can do it now and multitask or do it after the meeting is over, that would be really great. And so now we go back to questions. If you know who you want to answer your question and you can put their name on the question, that'd be great. But if you want to throw it up there for any of the panelists to answer, that's fine too.
Is it possible to ask a question via the phone?
Sure, shoot.
Okay, I have 2 questions for Emma. What exactly does no cause eviction mean? And secondly, in talking about developing hundreds of units of housing scattered around in all different kinds of geographic areas, is there anything in this bill that would not allow for those to be developed in forest lands or clear cutting any type of forest area?
Thanks so much for the question. Yeah, no cause evictions is really about this idea of a landlord needing to have a kind of narrow set of reasons for evicting somebody from their house. So it essentially extends the amount of time that a tenant would have to be able to respond to an eviction notice, and really sets limits on what those can be for, so that tenants aren't being kicked out kind of for no reason. It's essentially the idea there. And around the clear cutting, yeah, that's definitely been an issue that has been raised by multiple members of our coalition, and is something that we are working on and looking into. So I am our organizing director. I'm not our policy director. And so this is a question that I will bring back up with Josh, but definitely is one that's been raised and is certainly important. We don't need to be clear cutting forests for solar panels.
Well, not just for solar panels, for housing units, for building.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the language in the legislation looks like, since I'm not the right person to answer the question, but I can certainly get back to you.
Jeff, if I can jump in, last year and probably again this year, there was a woodland protection bill that the Audubon Society of Rhode Island was taking the lead on, focusing on preserving critical areas of habitat from development. So I know we all talked about like 7 different bills tonight. There are going to be more than 7 other additional bills addressing a variety of these issues, from solar siting to woodland protection as well.
Okay.
Other questions people have to type in, or here's one. Can someone speak to the state bond issue to be voted on in March? And how will it help these efforts?
I think Jed Thorpe from Save the Bay had posted about that earlier. I don't know if he might want to speak to that one.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly answer the question if that's okay.
Yeah.
So there are a series of bond questions that are going to be put before voters in a special election on March 2nd. Question 2 is the green bond. It's $74 million for the environment, and that includes $33 million for improvements to state parks and beaches and campgrounds, $15 million for clean water infrastructure, things like helping municipalities improve wastewater and drinking water treatment, $7 million for the state's municipal resilience program, which helps municipalities prepare for the impacts of climate change, $4 million in local recreation grants, $3 million for forest and farmland preservation, and $2 million for the Wonosquatucket River greenways projects. And, typically the green bonds pass with overwhelming support from the voters, but because this is a special election and because turnout's going to be very, very low, I'm a little more nervous than I typically would be. So every Rhode Island voter has been mailed a mail ballot application. If you haven't already filled it out, please do so. The deadline to send that back in, if you want to vote by mail, is February 9th. So if you haven't returned a mail ballot application, be sure to send that back in. But if people have more specific questions about the bonds, feel free to reach out to me after this call. But that's the green bond in a nutshell.
So we also had a question about, do we know who are the climate-friendly legislators? So I know that's a broad general question, but I know it's something Carrie has wondered about. We kind of assume people fall into 3 camps: the real climate champions that we don't really have to lobby, the other end of the extreme that are against us and it's probably not worth lobbying, and then a middle group that maybe we could have impact on. Do you guys have any ideas about how to identify the legislators that are most important to talk to?
I'm happy to start it off. I'm sure Kai and Emma want to add as well. There's at least two legislators on this call, which I think demonstrates some interest in the environment. I see Representative Potter and I saw Senator Anderson early. Conservation Law Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit, so we do not get involved in elections. But there are other groups like Carrie and Clean Water Action and Sierra Club who do endorsements. So you can do some research and see which candidates were endorsed by environmental groups. I've had the pleasure of meeting with a number of the newly elected reps and senators, and almost all of them are interested in a variety of environmental issues. And there are so many environmental issues that I think even the most conservative elected official is going to care about at least one of them. You can also look to past years and see who were the lead sponsors on bills. And if you don't know, I mean, pick up the phone, send an email, find out who your state rep is, who your state senator is. Carrie can help you figure this out. Emma mentioned it, or the Secretary of State website, and find something you have in common with that person. Because there's the bills that we mentioned tonight. There are bills on plastics. There are bills on toxic chemicals. I mean, there are so many environmental bills, and climate, is our top priority environmental issue. And that's what we're here talking about tonight. There was recently a survey done, and in Rhode Island, climate was the top issue for Rhode Islanders just after COVID. Legislators pay attention to polls. People vote. People care about climate. So I would like to think every legislator cares about climate, or they should care about climate. So let's be optimistic and reach out to everyone. And if you can't figure out what their position is on climate or the environment, call them, talk to them, and find out. We really need everybody on board to combat the climate crisis.
Yeah,
I
I
had a
think that was a
question
really, sorry, go for it.
that might be for Amy or Kai, which is about the Massachusetts climate bill, which the governor just vetoed, but which they're apparently passing again, like in the next week. So assuming that some version of that passes, how does that, like, which of these 7 bills, Rhode Island bills, does that relate most closely to? And, since sometimes our legislators like to do things that Massachusetts has already shown can be done, what can we learn from that?
I would be happy to answer that one, because in my work on Massachusetts policy, I was also involved with getting that climate bill passed. So I would say that is a very big bill, bigger than all of the bills that we have discussed tonight. And it contains components of a lot of the different ones we've discussed. Unlike Rhode Island, Massachusetts has had mandatory greenhouse gas emissions targets since 2005. And in some ways that in the early days, I think Amy explained, the Act on Climate bill was modeled after Massachusetts Global Warming Solutions Act. This bill is really about implementing the Global Warming Solutions Act. So in that sense, it is most similar to the 3 bills that I discussed. In fact, it contains a lot of overlap with the 3 bills I discussed. It specifically requires their version of the Public Utilities Commission, the Department of Public Utilities, to consider greenhouse gas emissions reductions in their energy efficiency programs. It also increases their renewable energy standard to try to get them speeding up their rate of decarbonization of electricity. In Massachusetts, the administration is already authorized to work on TCI, so they didn't have to do that component in their climate bill. It also increases the interim targets for addressing greenhouse gas emissions from 45% by 2030 to 50% by 2030. One area in which it's similar to one of the bills that Emma mentioned is its environmental justice language. It creates a new definition for environmental justice and requires certain consideration of environmental justice communities in permitting processes in the state. So that's something that we would love to see happen in Rhode Island as well. And as Justin said, we were obviously all devastated when the governor vetoed it, but I think that the Senate and House in Massachusetts were not happy with that. So they have already reintroduced it and are supposed to be passing it again within the week.
I also want to mention, most of you folks are probably familiar with the Environment Council of Rhode Island, which is sort of an umbrella group for all of the organizations in the state. They also publish a green report card, which I know Kai did a ton of work on, and typically that tracks and rates legislators based on their votes. So that's another place you can go to sort of do your diligence on legislators. And the report card was a little different this year. I don't know if you want to speak to that, Kai.
Yeah, we also got some awesome coverage of the report card, so I can drop that link into the chat. But this year in our legislative report card, rather than giving quantitative grades or letter grades to legislators, we gave all legislators an incomplete. And that's because not a single environmental bill over the last 2 years came to a vote. Usually we determine our grades for legislators based off of their positions when bills get to the floor, but we couldn't do that. And that just speaks to the lack of climate and environmental action we've seen in Rhode Island. We hope that the legislature can bring that incomplete to a in the next report card by passing a lot of the bills that we've discussed tonight. The Environment Council of Rhode Island will also be holding our annual legislative coffee hour. However, that has been postponed, just as a lot of things are being postponed right now because we're still not quite sure what the legislative session will look like this year.
Other questions? I think I've seen all the ones in the chat. There was one about solar siting in brownfields in South Providence, but Emma, I think you responded that you would get back about that, or?
Yeah, happy to be in touch about the specifics of this for sure. I think it makes sense to have a conversation for sure, Linda.
Thank you.
If there are no more questions, we could wrap up.
Thanks so much, everyone. We'll be at Conservation Law Foundation working on some other environmental issues as well. I know my colleague Kevin presented, I think last year, on plastics, and we're still working on toxic PFAS chemicals. So if there are other environmental issues that folks are interested in that want to talk about, myself or my colleagues are more than happy to join you. And as I said earlier, we are really grateful for the countless volunteer hours and all the awesome work that you were doing. And it really makes a difference. As Kai mentioned, the hearing last year on the Act on Climate bill, there were 2 rooms entirely jam-packed with people. We were there very late. There was testimony from all parts of the state, from people of different ages, different professions, different backgrounds, sort of telling their personal stories about why the climate crisis matters and why we need urgent action. And it would be awesome to be able to build on that this year. And we all need to work together to do that.
Yeah, and it may turn out to be easier to testify. You don't have to spend 6 hours sitting in the basement of the State House. If there's a way we can do it like this, and keep in touch electronically and all appear at the right moment, save a lot of time and hopefully be effective. If everyone saw Brandon's comment, Rep. Potter said just a few phone calls to legislators can create a sense of urgency, rallying 5 or 10 friends. Are you there, Brandon? You could say it out loud yourself.
Yeah, I'm happy to share it. I would just say from a lot of the conversations that I've been having with legislators, especially this week, with all of the confusion regarding the vaccine rollout, a lot of constituents are contacting people, and there's for lack of a better term, a lot of panic. And you can see how attentive legislators really are when they hear from a constituent. So I wouldn't undermine the viability of having, again, 5 to 10 people, if you can organize within your local community and have them reach out to a legislator, that can really, really be effective.
Thanks. Well, if that's it, I guess I really want to thank Amy, Emma, and Kai for the great presentation, and handling all, all those questions so nicely. This is I think a great kickoff for legislative efforts this spring. So we get something good and strong passed this year. And then we'll, maybe by the summer, we can have a giant party outside. So that would be good. And thanks everybody for coming and being part of this. We had a great turnout. Again, it shows how much people care about this, and it's a great sign for us going forward and really applying pressure where it needs to be applied. And so great. So hopes to see some of you people tomorrow night at the LED sign. And next Wednesday, we have another CARI meeting where Dr. Miles Lennon is talking about community solar and anti-racist principles and how they line up. So that should be really interesting.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, panelists. That was a lot of great information.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good night.